All right, I think we can begin. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think some of you, I hope some of you have been following us since Monday in this Justice Now Symposium on tackling the legacies of Europe's colonial past in the wake of Black Lives Matter. You will know that this symposium is a collaboration between the MIT Anthropology Department, where I teach. My name is Amaido. I'm assistant professor of Anthropology and African Studies at MIT. And we're collaborating with Avocats Sans Frontières, the international human rights NGO. And my co-organizer there is Liliane Moubiayi, who's research coordinator at ISF. And it's really our great pleasure and honor to organize this event through which we're trying to elucidate the links and the possibilities across struggles for racial justice in Europe today and efforts to address the colonial past. And there's a way that these questions have really risen to the forefront in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer. And so over the course of this week, we've had a series of panels that have taken a thematic approach to the question of the colonial past and its contemporary legacies and afterlives, and namely around or in the context of struggles for racial justice. And these panels have looked at past moments, past and ongoing movements for reparations, because what we're learning is that these movements take forever, or hopefully not forever, but they are very slow moving. We've had a panel about that was titled Provocations, as well as our keynote, which is about what should justice look like. So we know what the history, our keynote reminded us of the histories we're talking about. We're talking about colonialism and its effects on bodies and societies. So then in the face of that, what should justice look like? And this panel just before this one was on the opportunities that are available at the supranational level. So whether through the UN machine or the EU or the foundation system, the opportunity, and then also through NGOs like ISF, the opportunities that are available for engaging these questions, these struggles for racial justice, and the way that intersects with dealing with the colonial past. And really these roundtables, the first of which you are in today, are kind of what we've been building towards and what we are so excited for, because we wanted to, the beginning of this symposium were really events in Belgium, the establishment of the commission to examine Belgium's past in the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi, and which has been very complicated and offers some promise and also many issues, and which will be discussed in the Belgium Roundtable tomorrow at 2 p.m. Belgium time, 9 a.m. Boston time. But seeing what was happening in Belgium made Liliane and I wonder wouldn't it be amazing if we could have a conversation about what's happening in different European countries around these questions of the colonial past and racial justice, and facilitate a conversation across these different countries. But of course, the conversations are not limited to what's happening in the European country, right? There are conversations that are happening outside, namely in the countries that are tied to these European countries through the legacy and the history of colonialism. And so these roundtables, even though we've referred to them as a UK, France, Belgium, Germany roundtable, are not limited to UK-based, Germany-based, France-based, or Belgium-based actors. To the contrary, we were very eager to incorporate efforts coming from the continent and elsewhere also. So with that, I am so delighted to be here and delighted that you are here, and grateful to our moderator, Nabila Shabir, who will be facilitating the conversation in this UK roundtable. And I will disappear into the background and listen with great attention and gratitude to you all for joining us. And then I will come back at the end of the roundtable to just tie things together. And that's it. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Nabila. Thank you to our roundtable participants. And you can take it from here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Nabila Shabir, and I'm a British Pakistani journalist based in the Netherlands. I'm here in Amsterdam. I'm also so impressed by you, Amma and Liliane, for what was a twinkle in your eye last year when you were just like, what if we keep this conversation going in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement? And so it's really exciting to see that it's come together as a Justice Now Symposium, thanks to MIT and ASF for supporting. Thank you also to Mariel Garcia Montes at MIT, who's taking notes from this session, because indeed, as you said, Amar, this is the UK Roundtable. There's a France Roundtable happening at the same time. Don't leave us to go there, stay with us. And tomorrow, the Belgium and Germany Roundtables. So I'm really, really interested to see what all these experts that we've brought together are going to come up with today. We're going to spend about 45 minutes in discussion with our guests today, who are a group of incredible scholars, thinkers, writers, lawyers, and activists. And then we'll have about 30 minutes at the end to have a Q&A. So please do leave your questions in the little Q&A panel. Amma will also help identify anything that you'd like to put to any of our panelists. But let me start by asking our guests to start and introduce yourselves, if possible, and tell us a little bit about who you are. Let's start with you, Roswell.
Thank you so much, Nabila. My name is Rosbel Kagumire. I am based in Kampala, Uganda. I am a writer, I am an activist, and I have been working as an editor for an online platform called African Feminism, where I work with different African feminist writers to document stories and struggles of African women, mostly on the African continent, but sometimes from the diaspora. So that's me. And last year we published, I edited a book called Challenging Patriarchy and the Role of Patriarchy in the Rollback of Democracy in the East and Horn of Africa. So I look forward to having this conversation with you all.
Thank you. Esther?
Hi, greetings everyone. I'm Esther Stanford-Cossey and I'm a reparations scholar activist. I am co-founder of PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, also a co-initiator of the Stop the Mangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, and a co-facilitator of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. So that's me.
Thank you. Hi, Martin.
Thanks, Nabila. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Martin Mavenjina. I am a constitution and human rights lawyer based in Kenya. I work with the Kenya Human Rights Commission, where I serve as the program advisor for the Transitional Justice Program. I have vast experience working on security governance, transitional justice, indigenous rights, civic space, and also with victims of systemic human rights violations. My work, the nature of my work cuts across national and international levels, so I interact with a lot of the peer review mechanisms. My special focus is on the African human rights system and international humanitarian law. I am a member of the Law Society of Kenya, the International Commission of Jurists, Chartered Institute of Arbitrators Kenya and the United Kingdom. And I also serve as the chairperson for Democracy Without Borders in Kenya. I'm happy to be here and I look forward to a fruitful conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Everybody, I am Kyendi Andrews. I am Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, still the only university with a Black Studies degree program in Europe, which is a whole long another conversation. Also the founder of the Harambee Organization for Black Unity, editor-in-chief of Make It Plain, and just published The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. It's really, really great to have you all in this room together. And I hope we're going to use this space to have an open discussion. I won't be designating questions to any of you, but let's kick off with a very broad one, which is, you know, what are the main issues when it comes to the movements for racial justice or anti-Black racism in the UK? Floor is all of yours.
I can kick off with, I mean, I think there's a lot of things, right? So there's kind of where we are presently with this particular government. And I don't think we should really I don't think we can underestimate the government that we have. Ironically, it is one of the it is not one of it is the most diverse government in the history of the UK. It is also one of the most racist governments in the history of the UK, certainly within my lifetime, which is routinely has hostile environment policy around immigration, which has led to what you'd probably be aware of as the Windrush scandal. And that's only getting worse, actually, the immigration policy. If you look at the latest bills that have come out around policing, which have actually made defacing statues more severe punishment than for rape, right? If you look at the government, which has completely rejected any calls for diversifying, I wouldn't even call it decolonizing the curriculum, but diversifying the school curriculum and essentially saying the school curriculum is fine, and really got elected on this wave of really narrow English nationalism. So in terms of trying to get progress through those routes, I mean, honestly, the government is the biggest limitation. The other part of the limitations of this is, if you think about where we are movement-wise, we've gone from, in terms of actually being a large Black population in the UK, relatively recent in terms of migration, post-war, to have large numbers. We moved from a phase of being immigrants and what that means to being part of, not quite part of the nation, but really trying to build like British Black power in the 60s, 70s, etc. And over the last 40 years, I say generally, but not completely, there are still lots of grassroots organizers, actually Sister Esther's with us today. But generally there has been this move to kind of make society fairer, to change the laws, to change the institutions, etc. And I think where we've got to now is we realize that was basically a cul-de-sac, a dead end. And we end up with this terrible, really terrible racist government that is one of the biggest barriers to racial progress. So I think we're in a strange position where the kind of, can we fix the institutions? I think we're all kind of starting to realize that's not possible. And so actually, in some ways, we're in quite a good moment where maybe we can return to some of the more grassroots organization. But I don't know what Sister Esther thinks.
Yeah, I agree with that general context, but I think for me, it goes a lot deeper. It's true, we've seen a rolling back in terms of movements from below, but those movements still exist. And it's also true that I think people have been hoodwinked into thinking that because some of us have degrees of citizenship and are in certain positions of so-called power that maybe our parents or grandparents were not in, that somehow we've arrived. And clearly we've come full circle, and that's just not the case. And so for me, in looking at where we're at in terms of racial justice, because I'm part of a movement, or movements, I should say, interconnecting, so Pan-African movements and reparatory justice movement, which, as I said, interconnect, then what you find is that Pan-African activists, reparatory justice activists are not surprised with what we're seeing, because we know that these conflicts that we're having, or these grievances that we have, in terms of the British state in particular, and how that's impacting not just on us here, who are really, a domestic neo-colony, but also in terms of our home countries and our mother continents in particular. But this goes back centuries, and it's never been resolved. Britain has had, in terms of the establishment, has had various opportunities to try and resolve this, and movements for repair and redress have been going back to the mid-1700s in Britain. So for me, it's just a matter of deja vu, and that's why I feel it's important for emerging movements to also pay attention to pre-existing movements, and that movement histories, herstories, and lineages matter. They so matter, because there have been gains, but there's also been rollbacks on gains. So I think that's, for me, how I would answer that. And what we've seen that has been everlasting has been those movements from the ground up, who never kind of could gain access to the state, to the system anyway, and so continue doing what we've continued to do, to try and do what we can in terms of building communities, building institutions, teaching our children the truth about who we are and our place in the world. They've continued to grow, and we're seeing that crescendo now in that reparations has become a household word, although there are very diverse interpretations and misrepresentations of what, you know, movements for repair are really all about.
Yeah, I did want to say, I feel like I'm guessing in promoting your book, kind of, you've found yourself having maybe the same conversation over and over again as you present the story of empire to a universal audience. So I wondered, what are those key things that you find yourself, both of you, and anyone who wants to contribute, saying again and again in terms of changing this conception of what this story is about?
I've been having this conversation for the last, I don't know, 10 years. I mean, honestly, the amount of times I've been in a debate about, is Britain racist? I mean, still, like, that is still the level of the discourse here, where there is a complete lack of recognition of the racism of Britain. I mean, I guess the key things would be, it's everything's in the past, right? It's very distant. We've moved on. This is a new world. Why are we still complaining? The main conceptual problem is when we think about Britain, and this is for most European empires, because unlike in the States, where you have, you know, the state is where racism happens, it is where genocide happens, it is where slavery happens, it is where all the colonial violence happens. You have millions of African Americans, actually predating most Europeans, in America, means that you can just, America can't pretend that racism isn't there, because the whole country's clearly founded on white supremacy. Whereas in the UK, because we've offshored colonial violence, you know, slavery happens in the Caribbean, they actually call it, like, genuinely, they call it West Indian slavery, as though slavery wasn't British, right? Britain's role in slavery was to abolish it. I mean, that is genuinely how people conceive it here, that we should be proud of the Navy who ended the slave trade and abolished slavery. And why on earth are we, I should be grateful to Britain, apparently, for abolishing slavery, which is honestly, like, I'm writing a book now called The Psychosis of Whiteness, because there is no rational way to understand the way that Britain understands its role in history. So there's a complete denial that racism is part of Britain, and really is the idea that's promoted is that Britain's the fairest place, the best place. Beat the Nazis, that's the other one. Britain beat the Nazis, so must therefore be a racial utopia, and we should all be grateful. I mean, that's if I were going to sum it up, that is basically where we are in the discourse at the minute. And it hasn't, and I would say it hasn't changed. I mean, we had that last summer. There was a lot of discussions about race, Black Lives Matter. That lasted about 2 months. And if anything, there's been a bigger backlash in response to that, and reaffirmed all of this. And just look at the coverage of, as much as I hate talking about Meghan Markle, because it's a completely benign, not important thing, actually it's a perfect way to understand the problem of British race relations. So when she goes into the marriage, it's, oh, look, isn't this great? Britain's changed, post-racial. And now we see that's nonsense, and she wanted to kill herself because of racism, an experience that unfortunately far too many of us have in this country. And what do we see? We just see a complete denial of it. Oh, it's not a problem, the Queen's great, etc., etc. So honestly, it's tiring. I've kind of given up. That's why I'm writing the book, Psychosis of Whiteness, because this, but again, not in a negative way. I think this is a positive, because the solution has always been grassroots organization, Black power mobilization, and maybe now we can see it really clearly that really is the only thing to do here, because you can't rely on the state or the mainstream to really change.
I did see an interview with Avestas where she challenged someone and said, you know, we talk about abolition, but what was the commencement? And it's, you know, yeah, I feel like I don't have much to say to that. You know, you have to constantly go back to the beginning. Rosabelle, we spoke a little bit about what you thought about movements, especially when it comes to racial justice. I would love to hear from you a little bit, if you're still here.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much. I think I would like to really end this conversation by quoting Dr. Sylvia Tamale, who's a Ugandan professor who recently released a book on decolonization and Afrofeminism, and looking at what the feminist movements on the continent are doing, and reiterating the fact that colonialism did not mean the same thing for men and women. It did not mean the same thing for the rulers and the subjects. It did not mean the same thing for majority ethnicities and minority ethnicities. So when we are looking at colonial impact, to date, it's very important to know that there are really varied impacts still on the continent. But for me also, it's contemporary working on this on the continent, especially in the era of Black Lives Matter, when you saw this last year, debates rising among really elite people saying, this movement doesn't actually have anything to do with this. It was kind of sad because it's the epitome of like failure of the education system. Of course, we inherited a colonial system. It was not meant to educate us. So to even get an education that makes you critical of the very system you see in front of you is a struggle in most African countries. To elevate and make this struggle our part of an everyday struggle is very hard because the education system does not support that. It gives you a different narrative. We still teach our children that John Speke discovered the source of the Nile, which really, you know, that kind of thing still happens in Africa. This is the kind of curriculum we still hold on to, and we still have loads of work to do. So which in a way kind of makes, I'm looking at the challenges of movements and where it comes from. But also when you come to movements, even when people are aware of the history, I think it must be a Tanzanian scholar who talked about how the neoliberal approach to our movements on the continent erases the past, only concentrates on the present, okay? It's like, you need development, how much money is being swindled by your government, you know, how many women do you have in parliament? But we refuse to go back to know, for example, at independence, there were few even women allowed in school. And that was the work of colonialism and what it eroded and how it created hierarchies of people and what you know, what knowledge systems are prized over what. So it's a very difficult struggle, looking at racism and anti-imperialism in a structure where there are no longer white bodies. You know, you have white systems and globalized systems, but you don't have actual white people running the show visibly every day. So how do you as movements on the continent bring this struggle to the everyday struggles you're talking about? So it's still a very difficult struggle here, although there's been later highlight a couple of examples of the kind of movements that have put anti-imperialism and anti-racism at the heart of their movements.
I guess I wanted to call it again upon a kind of, because you've also been pointing out quite a bit in your career about education in the UK and the influences of colonialism on it. How could you speak a little bit to that?
I think it's a very similar story if you think about the education that's exported out to the former colonies and still is, right? Like still in many places, they still have very clear British education system. And what it is, it's a, what's the point of a school system? It is to reproduce the status quo, right? So you're not gonna learn about the British Empire at all. In fact, most students don't learn anything about the British Empire in the UK at all, won't learn about slavery, won't learn about the importance of all of these things to building the British nation, won't learn about anything, and won't even learn about Windrush and the migration. It really is this really narrow island story that you have, which is all about supporting this identity of Britain as this great, wonderful nation that's leader of the world. I mean, it really is awful. I mean, I don't know what else we would expect, because we have a society which is based on the same racial exploitation, white supremacy, as the British Empire was. So therefore, the school system kind of has to do this, right? Because if we told the truth, then we'd have to have a whole different conversation about where we are and what do we do. So I've never really had much faith that the school system would change, because the purpose of it is white supremacy, and it does it really well.
I wanted to throw up the next question, which was about the kind of claims for justice, for racial justice when it comes to our colonial past that have actually been made in the country. I feel like this is where our lawyers can come in and speak to us a little bit about those examples. Martin?
Thanks, Nabila. So before I respond to your question, I think it's important for audiences to get a brief background on the Mau Mau case in Kenya. And so the Mau Mau were a significant resistant movement emanating from the quest to reclaim lost land from the British settlers, in addition to securing independence from the colonial government. They embarked on an armed struggle against the colonial government, and this eventually led to a declaration of a state of emergency by the colonial government in October 1952 to December 1959. In this period, many Kenyans accused of participating in the Mau Mau rebellion were either killed or incarcerated in detention. And after a protracted struggle and eventual negotiation with other African leaders, Kenya finally attained independence on the 19th of December 1963. With this, with the attainment of independence, many Kenyans were liberated, but it still left a stain of human rights violations that would require redress. So fast forward in 2003, the Kenyan government expunged a subsidiary legislation that had proscribed the Mau Mau movement since 1950. This enabled the Mau Mau war veterans and victims of the colonial detention camps to organize themselves and seek reparations for the harms they had suffered at the hands of the colonial government. So with the support of the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Mau Mau War Veterans Association was formed, and the process of contacting and interviewing victims of emergency periods was undertaken, together with Lady, a British law firm with experience in supporting human rights violations. These efforts benefited from a series of studies from the state of emergency period, which had exposed the use of systemic widespread torture by the colonial government with the approval and knowledge of the British government then. Just one more thing, in the course of the trial, actually in the course of the trials, there was a time the British government had actually made a concession that the colonial government back then had in fact tortured the claimants. And despite this concession, they had actually appealed against a High Court decision at on the time question. So when they appealed against this time decision, what Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Mau Mau War Veterans Association, and other civil society actors decided to do is to embark on an advocacy campaign to pressure the British government to reach an amicable settlement with the claimants, some of whom were in the advanced, some of whom were advanced in age, and may have not been able to benefit from an eventual judgment. So this culminated into what Kavita already pointed us out. We identified 5,228 other victims who had a strong case based on the evidence that had been provided before the court. So while they were waiting the appeal of this decision, the British government elected actually to engage in negotiations, and that's what culminated into the four pillars of the four pillars of the set. I must point out that despite this significant victory achieved by victims in the settlement, it is clear that the settlement was not depictive of the true scale of human rights violations committed in the colonial era. The settlement was based on claims that could be identified and raised by the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Mau Mau War Veterans Association, and later on the basis of the limited resources and time available back then. In as much as this set a precedent that this case does, in as much as this set a landmark precedent, where the British government acknowledged systemic human rights violations that they committed back then. This in no way, for the veterans, this was it was not about the money. It was just about having the British colonial government, or the British government right now, acknowledge the human rights violations that they had actually subjected them to.
Can I come in here, Nabila? Because it's interesting hearing the report back on the claims. And I do have some, connection to this issue, in that as a PARCO activist, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, we worked with the Mau Mau Justice Network here in the UK that was led by Kenyans, that formed to sensitize the British and international publics as to the case of Matua and others, v Foreign and Commonwealth Office, that we've just heard about. And it's well known that PARCO was, a leading critic of the legal strategy that was embarked upon by Lee Day. That's well known. And one of the issues that we raised was the way in which the media or the courtroom of public opinion was misreading what the actual case was. And it does bring to light, you know, this question of, well, what is reparations? Because when, I mean, I was actually in, you know, the courtroom for a lot of the hearings before Justice McComb. And it was very stark to see the three co-claimants in particular, who were not necessarily literate in English, having to fly all these thousands of miles to sit before a judge in the British High Court, and to think somehow that that is about justice. It could never deliver justice. And it speaks to the point about the coloniality of power that still exists and the terms on which that settlement came about. It was framed as a case of torture in terms of three co-claimants. Obviously a settlement was reached, but that had consequences. So there was a follow-up case of Kimati and others, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and that case was for a wider group of claimants, 40,000 people, and that case did not succeed. So sometimes when we think we're making progress, because we don't look at it in a broader context, in a Pan-African context, in an international context, it ends up limiting opportunities that others may have in the future. And I feel that, you know, legal cases in particular around reparations actually need to be subjected to a lot of scrutiny by our communities. I accept that there is a place for legal action, but it has to be connected to legal strategies that movements themselves develop and shape. Because one of the things that was left out was the whole issue of land injustice in Kenya, but that's a question across Africa, and how land tenure has not been changed. So if we're talking about how racial injustice manifests in, you know, Black majority African countries, the land question is a huge indicator of that, in terms of who gets to own land, who benefits from the resources of those lands, and how those resources are actually still being denied, you know, the rightful heirs of those resources. So I think we have to problematize a lot of what we're waging in terms of conventional legal strategies that are disconnected from movements of liberation and resistance that exist. Because why did we need to have a second case that was for a much wider group of claimants? And then what we also have to look at is how sometimes these cases can really exacerbate what Sister Rosabel has mentioned in terms of the ethnic majorities and so-called ethnic majority, you know, a politicization of who's indigenous, who belongs, who was suffered, who was linked to, you know, whoever, in terms of the royalists. Those questions remain in our societies. And when the media glare goes, our communities, our people on the ground still have to live with the consequences. And for anyone that saw these elders and heard what they went through, to think that that settlement was justice, I'm sorry, I beg to differ.
So it does sound like, I mean, bearing in mind what Esther's pointed out, I mean, in the sort of media glare, it sounds like a success story that all this money has been paid out to claimants in a very harrowing and sad story of what happened in the Mau Mau uprising. But it is interesting to hear whether, you know, is this a process that can work then? You know, we spoke a little bit, Kavita, about this previously, but, you know, we don't have more cases. So what is the way forward when it comes to making more effective claims for justice, in getting what the communities actually deserve in terms of reparations? I don't know if anybody else has, Martin, or something to say to this.
Okay, Nabila, if I may, before Kavita responds, I think the other two cases against the British government were not successful because when the Kenya Human Rights Commission and LADIA were actually undertaking the Mau Mau case, it was discovered that actually the British colonial government back then destroyed a lot of files. So, and those files had a ton of evidence. So before they left Kenya, or right after they handed Kenya its independence, a lot of files were destroyed and some were actually taken back to Britain, and it actually took us a very long time to actually stumble on some of this evidence. So probably the reason why some of these cases have not been able to move forward is because of the lack of evidence that has already, of course, been destroyed by your would-be accuser or the person you instituted suit against. So, and still in response to your current question, it may actually be difficult to actually hold the British government to account, because without any out of evidence, you cannot actually hold them to account. And in most of their colonies in Africa, they did not leave any evidence. They actually took all this information with them. And the request for information by the Kenyan government actually started right after independence. So from 1967, there had been several requests to the British government to provide them with the files that had been actually taken back after the granted Kenya independence. But unfortunately, none of these requests has been granted. So the Mau Mau case is just a landmark decision, because it's the first time where you have Her Majesty's government actually acknowledging that, oh, we actually committed this large scale of human rights violations.
So can I come back in that there are lots of alternatives, okay, around this issue. So people's tribunals, international tribunals, are one mechanism that have been really developing since the 1960s, because this notion of access to justice, clearly we don't get access to justice locally, nationally, or internationally. And I remember when I was in law school, going to a critical law school, being taught the Karl Marx, maxim, that law is the will of the ruling classes enacted into legislation. So essentially, we're going to courts of the same system of oppression of white supremacy and expecting justice. I mean, that is just, that's mad. It's mad. And I'm reminded of the, that folk tale about, the goose thinking that they can get justice in the court of the foxes. It's not going to happen. With the Jewish Holocaust, you didn't have justice before Nazi courts. That's why they had to set up a Nuremberg tribunal. We have to create new legal mechanisms. We need to repair law. The very things that we're using to seek justice, everything is up for redress. We can't just leave anything out. If we're talking about the need to decolonize or even diversify curriculum, it works more so in terms of structures of law that from the beginning of our enslavement and our colonization and dispossession have legitimized conquest and are still doing so today. That's why large sections of the globe are still occupied by colonizers. And that has been legalized within national jurisdictions.
Thank you, Esther. We've got about 10 minutes before we open up for Q&A. And I just wanted to touch on the last point. Maybe Rosabelle can come in here and kindly. I wanted to know what the opportunities are, or the challenges of, advancing the struggles of, addressing our colonial past and this anti-racism struggle. Both of you have mentioned in different forums, this feeling of hope that younger people are becoming more aware of this story and can bring it forward. So could either of you speak to that?
Nabila, can I just
Oh yes, of course. Sorry, Martin.
Yeah, just before Rosabella comes in, the point that Esther raised is a very important point. The issue of land injustice in Kenya has never been solved, even despite this landmark case. There's still allegations that the large tracts of land in Kenya are still owned by British aristocrats. The other form of land ownership has been by British corporates who either incorporate companies in Kenya and they own vast tracts of land. Currently, the Kenya Human Rights Commission has been doing work around Kakuzi. I think you've seen the case around Kakuzi, where a company actually has been, it's a company that has leased large tracts of land, but on the other hand, they've been committing massive human rights violations. And that is only in one part of Kenya. But when you look at most parts of Kenya, these large tracts of land are either owned by companies with British affiliates, or they're purportedly owned by people in a magistrate's government. So you ask yourself, you would ask yourself, we're in 2021, and we're still grappling with the issue of land injustice. So we have to ask ourselves, so how far have we come, even despite the fact that we had a landmark judgment?
Thank you, Martin. Would anybody like to come into that, or should we can move on to our last point, perhaps?
Sure. Thank you, Nabila. I really wanted to comment on the fact that to reiterate, like what justice looks like for different people on the continent. And going back, of course, we've looked at ethnic minorities also, but also like when you have different social groups, when you look at, for example, the criminalization of queer Africans that has had such an immense impact on lives and in these communities and people. How do you define justice, colonial justice for groups like that? Definitely the fact that in most of these countries, they are still not even recognized. What is justice for groups like that? And for me, we have to always go back and know that colonialism did not impact everybody the same, men and women the same, queer people the same as heterosexual, cisgender people. So to be open to understand how beyond courtrooms, what reparations and justice could look like, and connecting that to the current and current movements on the continent. And I've already said that sometimes it's very frustrating to see our movements, political movements, squarely focused only on a dictator in their view, in front of them, seeing a lot of course, movements, political movements, very co-opted or even like overshadowed by white liberal people who are at the forefront of African movements, right? Like they come in and swing by to be your saviors. But and recently, I think I had a problem with one of them who said that Museveni is like a colonizer. I'm like, excuse me, we haven't even gotten our reparations, right? Like we understand who Museveni is. You don't have to dress him in a colonizer for us because we live under him. You don't have to dress him as that to appeal to your Western audience who have not even dealt with the fact that colonized people need reparations. And for me, I think it lies in how do we connect these conversations to ongoing movements on the continent, be it feminist movement, being mainstream political movements that we are having very young, we are very young continent right now, and going beyond, having, for example, the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, democracy development office, having this whole new brand about open societies. What is open societies when you have never paid reparations? Colonization as colonization is a crime itself. We don't have to prove that you murdered my grandfather. We know that you murdered my grandfather because he's no more. We don't need your documents, your colonial documents. I think we need to be able to infuse this language, to infuse this kind of movements within our ongoing movements, because when I observe, it feels like colonization and imperialism is an afterthought for most movements, apart from a couple of movements, of course, we saw in South Africa, because of course the history is quite very fresh with apartheid. We saw a lot of movements again by young people about hair in school, black children not being allowed in school because of their hair. And it's not even something focused on in South Africa. We've had the same in Kenya, Malawian court had to rule against the school not allowing Rastafarian children to attend school. The same happening in Ghana this week, right? So we still have these issues, but I just think that when we are fighting for the mainstream movement, we forget that our fight does not begin with the leaders we see in front of us. We are fighting structural systems that were left here. We're fighting subjugation that is in our very laws and systems that we inherited. So I think that we have a lot of work to do on that, because then that's how we come up with only a case for what we might seem as the extreme scenes of colonialism. But colonialism was not always blatantly, visibly violent. In fact, on the whole, in many places like Uganda, was subtle, violently subtle, right? Like it takes you time to even realize, oh, my culture is gone. I don't have a name, you know, I have an English name now. So I think that we have to move movements. And I say that for me, the last 1 year, I learned a lot looking at Black Lives Matter and seeing arguments in different mainstream media, thinking that Black Lives Matter was something distant. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think we have to come back to get out of this box of neoliberal approach on our human rights. For example, everybody sees a human right, or the most human right is, can you protest? Can you live without torture? But we have been boxed into these boxes of looking at our lives as Africans, into this coloniality and neoliberal language of not looking at ourselves as a whole and looking at those who are left on the margins of this whole colonial venture. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, can I just throw in a Malcolm X quote just to support all of this? Is, you know, you don't take your case to the criminal, you take the criminal to court, right? And I think that the Roosevelt's perfectly right there, is that what we're missing is that colonialism hasn't actually ended. Like, it's still there. The structures still exist. The legal frameworks, the economic frameworks, the bodies that we're going to, the United Nations, for example, that we're going to saying, look, we need justice. Those are the problem. Like, they're just as bad as the old mechanism. We're in a new age where things look a bit different, but really are the same. So if we're having movements that are legit, so we go to these places, we actually legitimate the system which is oppressing us. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do the cases, you shouldn't have legal remedies, but there's a in the Panthers called survival pending revolution, where it's like, look, you have to do certain things because they're just necessary, but you understand that those things are also not going to solve the actual problem, because the problem is the system. And there is no justice within this political and economic system. It is simple as that. It's not possible, because today is just as bad as 100 years ago. And so what we should be using these things is to say, well, actually, how do we dismantle the system? That we need a new system. The word here is revolution, but it's a word that we stopped talking about because, you know, we all got carried away thinking we could reform this. But the reality is there's no reform to this. And it is going to take those kind of revolutionary mechanisms which create a completely new political and economic system.
Thank you, Candace. So we have half an hour left, and there's a few questions here. One of those, I'm going to attempt to translate this from French. Let's see, here we go. Did lawyers and researchers have access to the British National Archives when you're talking about the evidence that was taken away, which you referenced, Martin? Does anybody have an answer to that one?
I could say something, and then I'll let Kapita add. So when we started, if you all remember, at the beginning of our presentations, we did indicate that most of this evidence was taken out. So in Kenya, we have a national archives that is usually the depositor of most of the documents from way back then. So we weren't able to find any tangible evidence within the national archives. And earlier on, I'd mentioned the Kenyan government, since after independence, had actually tried to get some of these files from the British government, even up to the point that even we started this, we started the journey towards this case in 2003, but there was an attempt in futility. So in the course of actually litigating this case, initially the British government had denied existence of any of this information at all, and more or less look like we're just busybodies. So you will make a request for evidence and somebody tells you, hey, what are you talking about? Or, I mean, and usually in litigation, if you can't actually prove that somebody actually has this evidence, or if it's actually destroyed, then it becomes, I mean, you more or less look like you've hit a dead end.
Kinda in the process of doing your research, did you find it easy to access these archives, or how did you go about it?
No, so it's not. It's actually the UK is tricky. Generally, Official Secrets Act. It's not like, again, like the US. You have a lot more access to documentation. The UK is terrible. Like, really, it's hard to get access to so much stuff. In particular, even not just colonial stuff, but in the UK. So if you want to try and find the, so for example, to compare to the US, so we have so much detail on FBI programs, police surveillance of Black Power in the United States. There is no doubt this happened in the UK, but it's so patchy because you just can't get access. The Official Secrets Act means you can't get access to MI6, stuff like that. It's almost impossible. So we just kind of hear the whispers of this. And again, in the UK, it's no different than the colonies, and you've seen the destruction of documents and etc. Britain's been very good at hiding the details and the evidence for its terrible past.
Thank you. There is a question from Roberta, which I shall ask here, and it is about what the panel knows about the ongoing war on the former British colony of Southern Cameroon. The UK government ignores what the Norwegian Refugee Council calls the world's most neglected crisis. And there are many Anglophone Cameroonians here in the UK, and people in this country are not educated about this history or informed about the present horrors. What can be done? This war has been going on for over 3 years while the former Anglophone colony has struggled for equal rights. That's a question from Roberta.
Okay, so if I could to respond to that, Nabila. So last year we did some, together with some civil society organizations, we've been doing some advocacy work on the numerous human rights violations that are going on happening in Cameroon. And what we found, based on the information that was provided to us by CSO partners within Cameroon and also those out of Cameroon. Now, for the longest time, what President Paul Biya has done is that he has tried to, he's always paid his dues to France, so France will never disturb him or never come to him. The other thing that we stumbled up with, we actually did not know about, was that, so apparently, when states appoint ambassadors, the longer your ambassador stays in the country, the more senior he or she becomes, and so he gets to chair all the ambassadors within the specific country. For instance, right now in the UK, if the Cameroon ambassador has stayed there for the longest, he gets to chair all the rest of the African ambassadors. So if we're all ambassadors, that simply means that if I raise an agenda on the human rights situation in Cameroon, it can be, staggered and be discussed at his discretion. So this is it's more or less of the foreign policy that they've used in all their countries. So if you look around most countries around the globe, Cameroon does not change its ambassadors. They actually even die on the job, right? Which is a stark difference from all other countries that from time to time would change the ambassadors. So that is another ploy that they've used to defeat accountability. The third one is for a long time you've had over restriction of civic space, internet shutdowns in Cameroon. So it's not easy for information to trickle in and out of Cameroon itself. And of course, the last trend they had is that even the would-be European partners, or even the partners out there who would actually want to hold Paul Biya to account, have actually just left Cameroonians on their own. So unfortunately, everybody out there, the world superpowers, Britain, the US, France, they've just done a blind eye, and like it's more or less of like, your problem, deal with it. So it's kind of very difficult to hold Paul Biya to account. And for a president actually who in his last election, campaign just wants to an audience, and then we're told, well, he won his election. So you see the stark difference. So, so based on at least the work we've done on Cameroon, those are the stumbling blocks that we found. But be as it may, we've come up with a strategy where we want to hold President Paul Biya and his government to account, because there are massive human rights violations that are being committed day in, day out. Actually, Paul Biya's government is akin to the colonialists back then, right? People are dying on the daily, people are being unlawfully arrested on a daily basis, and the violence is just massive.
Yeah, and I would add, I am familiar with this struggle as a Pan-Africanist, and many African heritage communities, both from the continent and in the diaspora, that I work with within and beyond the UK are familiar with this struggle. But also I think it's important to recognize that this is one of such, there are several, if not quite a few, of such struggles in Africa today. And so whilst it's important to recognize the specificities, if we don't address that Berlin Conference consensus, through which many of these struggles and tensions around who belongs, what these nation states are, how they've come to be formed, and how they continue to actually promote what's called negative ethnicity, okay? And the politicization of who belongs, who is indigenous. And until we can restructure Africa, you know, the true vision of what all generations from the time, you know, going back to ancient, you know, civilizations in Africa, who have had visions that we can actually come together. Despite cultural differences, we can unite across those. So we have to take the best of that, but we have to reform Africa, not in the sense of patching it up, like Brother Kehinde said. It's not in a reformist way, but in terms of we have to repair that, because the Maangamizi, which is the Kiswahili term for the African Holocaust, also is in Africa. And a lot of it is structural in terms of these very borders and these conflicts, where we're seeing a lot of these wars that are fomented and exacerbated by Western powers, and it's in their interest to keep going. We see the hand of colonialism, the hidden hand of colonialism and the neo-colonial context. And so the repair, in terms of the movements for repair, and by the way, as the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, we do work with African reparationists who are part of indigenous communities that are also reclaiming space, reclaiming even who they are on the continent. And to do so actually is considered treasonous, because anyone that tries to defy these borders, which somehow are deemed to be sacrosanct, is actually accused of committing treason. So that is the problem, that we have to go beyond that. And there is a vision of a repaired Africa that's based on the best of some of our African value systems and cultures and you know, knowledge systems. So Ma'at and Ubuntu, in terms of how we relate to others and recognize our humanity, comes through recognizing the humanity of others. And that is a borderless Africa to which we all can belong. Not just those at home who are struggling to reclaim their own sense of self, but also those of us who are diaspora, who didn't have a say in being kidnapped from the shores of that continent, and who also have a right to return and a right to exercise our right to belong, whether we live in Africa or not. Not these multinational corporations who it's in their interest to see us killing each other, because that's what they want. And in the era of eco-fascism and depopulation, we better wake up to this.
Thank you, Esther. This was exactly the question which Nancy had asked in our Q&A. Nancy also wondered whether Rosabelle could answer that question. She asked, how do we move forward reparations when it's clear that the post-colonial state has more or less capitulated to a neo-colonial order? So I don't know if you have something to say also to add to that, Rosabelle?
I think I kind of alluded to it. Sorry, my power is out. I hope you can still hear me very well. I'd alluded to it in the fact that we need our current movement to incorporate this anti-imperial struggle, because clearly we don't have the leaders that represent the public interest overall in most countries. It's not every country, but in many countries, the struggle to actually have leaders that represent our interests squarely is still a struggle. So if they don't represent our interests, they're not going, even locally, they're not going to even be invested in fighting for interests in terms of going beyond and seeing the foundations of the state they are ruling. So I think it's very important to then, for me, my hope is in the young movement and the young people to make our movements a little more deeper ideologically and ground them in understanding, like, we are not just fighting for what is termed as democracy, we are fighting for existence, for our countries, our people, our full humanity to be recognized, not just in these borders, but to be as free as any other human on this earth, that we have boundless opportunities, and that we are able to be recognized as some, like, we did not appear here by accident, you know, it was by design. So we need to address that. But I just don't think that for certain leaders, that's not where my hope is, because they're not even delivering sometimes the minimum that the population wants. So I think that the young people's movement, they're different from academia to the activists to different people that are pushing, that we have to infuse this understanding of how imperialism works and what anti-colonial, anti-racism looks like in the 21st century African movement.
Thank you. Kaindi, do you have anything to add to that, what Roswell just said?
No, just to fully agree. I mean, I think that is the struggle. The struggle really is, and I think we understand what the problem is. I think we know that we need to have, you know, fundamental change. But the question is, how do you build it? I think there's been lots of efforts to do that historically, lots of efforts to do that now. But the question is, how do you build and sustain that? Because the big thing that changed, the only really thing that changed, if you think about 50 years ago, when we're thinking about revolution and overturning, and this is a real possibility, there's two things that happened. One, lots of people got killed. And let's not pretend that this doesn't still happen or wouldn't still happen. Violence has always been used to maintain the system. And then the second thing, which is probably more insidious, was, society opened up just enough. So it's not coincidental that you have racial relations legislation in 65 in the UK, you have the civil rights legislation in the US, you have so-called independence movements, so-called independence granted, across the former colonies. You have this kind of emerging middle class. Look, I'm part of it, so I say that now. I couldn't have been a professor. It's unlikely I'll be a professor now, but 50 years ago, forget about it, right? So it's opened up enough that we've started to think we can shift it. And so the big thing is, how do we get beyond that? And how do we go back to kind of building these real alternatives? And that's always been the struggle, is how to do it. But if we start asking that question, and then in 50 years' time, we could be in a very different place.
Thank you. There's a question here for you, Esther, from Julia. And she wanted to go back to your point that what can concretely be done about the issue of land. She says it sounds like a very urgent yet complicated matter to be addressed.
It is urgent, it is complicated, and it's important to recognize that it's historical. So we're not going to have quick fixes, okay? And without decolonization in the true sense, which includes decolonization of our whole being, not just our whole being, but our lands as well. So I would say very concretely, what needs to happen is land audits, if they haven't already been done, or they need to be updated across, Africa and other parts of colonized places in the global south. So I know in Azania, South Africa, in 2017, there was a land audit that showed that 72% of the most arable land was still in the hands of white people. That is shocking, okay? And that's just one country. We know Kenya has similar issues. We know Zimbabwe does. And what we should not be doing is actually compensating those who have benefited from ill-gotten gains in Africa today for lands, in terms of land reclamation, as happened in Zimbabwe. So this is why when we try and fix our African societies, even on the continent, in a narrow national chauvinistic way, we end up actually making many compromises and settlements which are based on weakness. no existing African nation or people or group on the continent can wage this struggle on their own. That's why I'm, you know, an advocate of Pan-Africanism, because it's got to take all of us, including the power in terms of people power of the diaspora, who can be putting pressure on those corporations, on those landed gentry who have lands overseas. We can be doing that in the diaspora, and we are doing that. So without land reform and agrarian reform, it's not just about giving the land back to some people. We have to change the use of the land. And at a time when so many of our lands are still being grabbed in terms of agribusiness, in terms of the climate and ecological crisis, we're being dispossessed, especially indigenous peoples in Africa, then that's what's urgent. So we cannot get to Uhuru, as we would say in Kenya, in terms of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, the slogan, until we actually address and fundamentally transform, decolonize Africa and restore African sovereignty, which means that we do not pay colonizers for land that they stole. But we also need the support of our allies and all other peoples who are seeking justice, who can stand with us. Because the price that our people back home are paying for even standing up today to defend lands is death. And not enough of us are standing in solidarity with those movements on the ground, because we don't even know they exist. And even if we know they exist, we're not reporting on it. And it's something I have to say that we're not hearing from Black Lives Matter either. So yes, the situation is critical. And we have to give reverence and respect to those movements. Of course, there are newer movements, but ultimately, if we don't even have space to exist, how can we then envision other forms of what freedom should look like?
Absolutely. Thank you, Esther. We've got 10 minutes left, and I wanted them to pick up on that point a little bit, and also what Kendi said, which is, you know, this is a moment, and we're looking together in this roundtable for, you know, what this historical moment can afford, you know, and if we're looking to make opportunities, I mean, we can't solve this issue, and it's not a comfortable one, and we shouldn't be comfortable in it, of course. So, you know, can I hear from maybe each one of you on, yeah, what do you think, you know, what can we make the most of now from the opportunities that we have in advancing our movements? So maybe we can go to you, Martin.
Thanks, Nabila. If you could just allow me about 30 seconds just to go back to, I entirely agree with what Esther said. And it's quite immoral actually for anybody in this world today to be owning over 1,000 acres of land. I mean, in Kenya, we have people who own it. And I mean, the people who own 500,000 acres of land. And you ask yourself, what are you going to do with 500,000 acres of land? It's just immoral. It's not moral right to own vast tracts of land. And what is actually worse about the land question is that they will never show you documents that they actually legally acquired these lands, but they'll always insist that we own these pieces of land. And then thirdly, we have made, there were significant strides made in Kenya, whereby we came up with the maximum and minimum acreage bill. But along the way, that bill that would have brought about fundamental reforms in the land question in Kenya was killed. It's just actually stuck, lying somewhere in a parliament. So in as much as legislation is the good way forward, nobody wants to, you know, pursue that angle. Unfortunately, not nobody actually, but our political actors, you know, and the corporates do not want to pursue that angle, and they'll do everything to ensure that you do not make any kind of significant progress. But back to your question, I think what needs to be done is that first, it would be just it would be a positive step in the right direction if the British government to date can actually acknowledge that they actually committed massive human rights violations in most of the colonies. It would also be good for them to kind of come up with some form of reparation, because reparation can be monetary, it can be for a form of apology. But when you sit in your ivory tower and you just tell us that we are not aware of some of these violations in some of these in some of the African countries, or there's no evidence, and yet they destroyed most of this evidence. It's just like, you know, somebody either slapping you or spitting in your face. The other thing that I need to be that I think needs to change, that would help in, you know, moving this conversation forward, is we need to change the mindset in Africa. Rosabelle earlier on raised a very valid point. I always ask myself, why exactly should a child in Africa be learning about British history or European history, about Napoleon? I mean, I learned about Napoleon, and back then I would ask myself, so why am I learning about Napoleon, you know, or King Louis? And coincidentally, you know, after passing through your education, you've never got to apply this knowledge. So I always look back and I say, what a waste of my time in school, because the essence of acquiring knowledge is to be able to apply it somewhere. But it's a form of indoctrination. So I think that also needs to change. Africans should learn African values. Those in Europe should, you know, appreciate their values. So that is what I would say for now.
Thank you. Rosabelle?
I would say that still continue to say that we need to really bring the decolonizing language from the academia to everyday life. You know, there's a lot of work that or scholars have done on the continent on decolonizing, and also painting what the future can look like and or alternatives. But we need to get these out of these small circles of academia and get them to the young people to start imagining, to start questioning. When you look at movements like the climate change movement, we need to decolonize. When you find the climate change movement is dominated by global north, these are the stars of global climate change. They are the ones who are pushing. I'm like, what have you lost to understand this? Sometimes, you know, it's these conversations that we have to infuse, even when our young activists that we see that are involved in this, that they need to be equipped with the language, decolonization language, to position themselves and position the people. When you look right now on the continent, I think last year was working with EWID on a series on actually the most killings of activists are women and environmentalists on this continent. And because they are not on the streets rioting, rather protesting, their stories die. They are back of the dailies, you know, because they are fighting multinationals. They're fighting very many corporate interests, very many imperial interests. And these grassroots women and environmentalists are dying. They're being killed right in their communities, and nobody talks about it or carries the legacy. So we need these movements at the grassroots, even those who have land to protect the land they have, and those who have been dispossessed to continue fighting to get back their land.
Thank you. Esther?
Yeah, for me, I think it begins with a very simple thing of telling the truth. We should tell the truth to ourselves and each other and the world. Part of what colonization and continuing coloniality does, it tries to subjugate the truth. And many of us, the majority of humanity, have been complicit in those subjugations. The other thing I would say in terms of hope is building community, yeah? Communities of resistance. Not accommodation or surrender or paralysis, but resistance with a view to transformation. And I'm really guided here by some of the work that was done by Huey Pugh Newton in terms of revolutionary intercommunalism. And that if we have communities of communities, and in the UK, we have an African heritage community which we refer to as a community for national self-determination, that's linking organically with African communities on the continent in West Africa. And we refer to ourselves as a Ma'at Ubuntu Jama. So it's a community that is repairing itself, linking with, home continental communities, which are referred to as Sankofa Homes, under the auspices of Ma'atu Buntu Mitau Grathric, where these are indigenous communities that are linking with diaspora communities, and we are reconnecting, we are remembering ourselves and this journey, because we've been separated for centuries. So the answers are going to come because of what we both bring. So the authentic, but also the innovations in terms of diaspora. That's what gives me hope. And those are the building blocks of the repaired Africa that I've referred to as Ma'atu Buntu Man. It's happening now.
Thank you. Finally, Kendi, I guess the opportunity that you're working on right now at this moment is writing about psychosis of the white. So maybe, what do you think?
No, I mean, look, I think the importance of this, and I think that I always write anything really, is to kind of, and I think this moment is a really excellent moment of this. And I think when you see the young people out in the street today saying Black Lives Matter, and it's the 21st century, and we still have to say Black Lives Matter. And I think this generation is a generation that's grown up in that promise, the promise that things are going to change, things are going to get better, we're all moving in the right direction. And they know, right? They get it. They understand. They've seen that don't work. And so I think that's where you get the revolutionary potential, when you have a group of people who can't be convinced, can't be tricked, can't be brought up, because they've seen it. They've seen what happens over the last 40 years. And so I think this is the moment where you can kind of reclaim that radical movement. Again, it's like Esther says, it's been there. There's movements there. It's not like it's totally declined. But that really is where the focus needs to be. Kind of tagline for this book is revolution is necessary. Like, once we understand and tell the truth, then we come to the conclusion that you just have to do something completely different. That's the purpose of the book, Psychosis of Whiteness, is to say, look, we've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. There's no convincing people out of this. I've been involved in way too many conversations, and it's just like talking to yourself. It just goes around and around and around. Doesn't matter how much evidence you put on the table, it's just round and round and round and round. And so what we need to do is create, and the whole idea of psychosis is that, and it's not just about white people, but whiteness, and there's many Black people, Asian people, who are just as infected, if you like, by the psychosis of whiteness. And the point of that is to say, well, look, that's produced because of the political and economic system. So if you want to get rid of it, you have to get rid of the political and economic system, which means building a new world. And we have the tools to do it, right? So the irony is, if again, Sister Esther is 100% right here, that it is about that global connections. And look what we're doing right now. Like, we have never been in a time where it's been easier to have the connections that we need in order to bring about revolutionary change. Unfortunately, the access to these kind of technologies makes us think that we're okay and we don't need revolutionary change. That's the biggest problem. But I think hopefully in this moment we'll understand that it's time to do something different, and we have the connections and possibilities to do it. So it's just up to us that we need to make those changes.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. We're almost right out of time. Esther, Kendi, Rosabel, Kavita, Martin, it's been such an honor to spend the last 90 minutes with you. I'm just going to let Amma in, who's going to end us off. I don't know if she's around somewhere.
Yes.
There we go.
I am here. Thank you all so much. I mean, this was such a rich discussion. And thank you, Nabila, for so expertly steering and kind of creating space for this conversation. I mean, I am incredibly just humbled and grateful for all the work that you're doing and that you shared it with us today. I think to echo Kehindi's point, that's exactly, you know, the possibilities that this moment affords to create connections across movements that too often can be described or spoken about in discrete manners, right, as distinct from each other. And I think what came out very powerfully today is the fact that, in fact, they're very and profoundly connected. And as many of you are suggesting, change is going to require really getting to this root and require revolution and kind of these truly transformative efforts. And I'm so heartened that all this work is happening and for the multiplication of voices and approaches that you brought to the table. So thank you all so much for sharing that with us. And I am so excited. I was hearing from the echoes from the French Roundtable that they had a crazy stimulating conversation also. And so I can't wait for all of us to get around a massive table on Friday to hear each other and keep exploring the possibilities for transformation. So again, thank you all so much to our panelists. Thank you so much, Nabila. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us on this ride. And we look forward to everyone joining us tomorrow for the Belgium Roundtable at 9 a.m. Boston time, 2 p.m. Brussels, and I think that's 1 p.m. UK time tomorrow. And so thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.